Tulip Mania didn't crash the Dutch economy. It involved barely 300 traders, almost no bank lending, and zero major business failures. The story you know was invented decades later. By the end of this video, you'll understand what actually happened in Amsterdam during the winter of 1636, why the myth of a national mania grew up around a relatively minor market event, and the real reason bubbles are remembered the way they are, and it changes how you see every financial bubble you've ever heard about. If you've ever taken an economics class, read a business article, or spent any time on financial social media, you know the story. In the 1630s, the Netherlands was the richest country on earth. The Dutch Golden Age was in full bloom. And into this wealthy, sophisticated society arrived something new and beautiful, the tulip. Brought over from the Ottoman Empire by botanists and traders, these flowers were unlike anything Europe had seen. Vivid colors, delicate patterns, a brief and dramatic bloom. The rarest varieties, with their striped, flame-like petals, caused by a mosaic virus that infected the bulbs, became status symbols among the wealthy merchant class. And then, the story goes, things got out of hand. Ordinary people began buying bulbs. Weavers sold their looms, and farmers sold their land. A single bulb of the most prized variety, the Semper Augustus, was supposedly worth more than a house on an Amsterdam canal. At the peak in February 1637, the market collapsed. Prices plummeted by 99% within days. Rumors spread of people ruining themselves over tulip speculation, and the popular narrative claims an entire nation was brought to ruin by greed. This story has been told and retold for nearly 400 years. It appears in Charles Mackay's iconic 1841 book Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, every standard economics textbook, and countless mainstream finance articles. It has become the default reference for every modern financial bubble, from the dot-com boom and housing bubbles to crypto surges and meme stock frenzies. Whenever an asset's price skyrockets on apparent irrationality, people are quick to draw the parallel, this is Tulip Mania all over again. And it is, for the most part, not true. Modern historical research tells a very different story. There were no bank failures following the 1637 crash, no major merchant houses collapsed due to tulip investments, and no economic recession ensued. The Dutch Golden Age continued to thrive for another generation, and the Dutch East India Company, the world's most valuable corporation at the time, was virtually unaffected by the tulip market's collapse. There are no contemporary paintings of widespread ruin. No diaries from ordinary people describing financial devastation. The city of Amsterdam's records show no unusual spike in bankruptcies or debt defaults. In fact, the Dutch economy kept growing through the entire period. If this was the greatest speculative mania in history, the textbook example of crowd madness, where is the damage? So if the tulip crash didn't break the Dutch economy, what did happen? And why do we all believe it did? To understand what actually happened, you have to understand what was being traded. And the answer is, almost no actual tulip bulbs. What changed hands were trading contracts, written agreements to purchase bulbs at a future date, specifically during the summer harvest, when bulbs could be unearthed and resold. These were essentially futures contracts, standardized financial agreements where a buyer commits to purchasing an asset at a fixed price on a predetermined future date. No upfront payment was required, and all contract settlements were deferred. The market for these contracts didn't take place on an exchange. It took place in taverns. Small groups of professional bulb merchants and wealthy enthusiasts would gather, drink, and negotiate contracts. The whole scene was informal, unregulated, and very small. How small exactly? Based on surviving trading records from Haarlem and Amsterdam, historians estimate only 250 to 300 active traders participated in the tulip contract market, out of a national population of roughly 2 million. This was never a nationwide mania. It was a niche trading activity exclusive to professional bulb merchants and wealthy upper-middle-class enthusiasts. Most people in the Netherlands had never bought a tulip contract, never seen one, and probably never heard of the market until after it crashed. So what does this mean? It means the standard image, an entire nation swept up in madness, is wrong. This was a specialized market for a luxury collectible, populated by people who could afford to lose money. Now let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the story gets interesting. It is true that a Semper Augustus bulb, at the peak, sold for roughly 5,000 guilders. And it is true that a modest house in Amsterdam cost about that much. That comparison is real, and it's striking. Yet Semper Augustus bulbs were extraordinarily rare, with only about a dozen specimens in existence across the Netherlands. They were the floral equivalent of one-of-a-kind fine art paintings. Judging the entire tulip market by the price of these ultra-rare bulbs is analogous to using a Picasso's auction price to define the value of the global art market. For the vast majority of tulip varieties, prices were much lower. Common bulbs traded for single-digit guilders. Even most rare varieties were in the tens or hundreds of guilders, not thousands. Most historians place the total notional value of all outstanding tulip contracts at its peak at under 10 million guilders. While this was a substantial sum for a niche market, it paled in comparison to the Dutch East India Company's 60 million guilder valuation and the Dutch Republic's annual GDP, which reached hundreds of millions of guilders. The tulip market was a rounding error in the Dutch economy. The market did crash in February 1637, with prices for the most speculative tulip varieties plummeting by 90% or more. However, nearly all trades were zero-down futures contracts, meaning almost no actual capital had been exchanged up front. As a result, real monetary losses were extremely limited. And here's the other key detail: the city of Haarlem, where much of the trade happened, essentially voided the contracts. Buyers could walk away by paying a small penalty, typically about 10% of the contract value. Most did. The losses were real for the people involved, but they were contained. No banks collapsed. No supply chains broke. The economy kept turning. Again, so what does this mean? It means the crash was real, but its impact was about as large as a major art market correction, notable to the people in that world, invisible to everyone else. So how did a relatively minor market event among a few hundred traders become the most famous bubble in world history? The myth was built, layer by layer, over hundreds of years. The first layer of this myth emerged immediately amid the market's collapse in 1637. A flood of pamphlets circulated across Dutch cities, but these were not objective news reports. Written primarily by Calvinist preachers and moral reformers, they were satirical moral critiques designed to warn the public against greed and worldly indulgence. The pamphlets used exaggerated imagery: fools with tulip heads, people throwing themselves into canals, because that's how you make a moral point stick. They were the 17th century equivalent of an opinion column with a strong editorial slant. Over the next century, historians and authors recycled these exaggerated tales without verifying original source materials. With every retelling, the scope of the mania expanded, the severity of the crash worsened, and the number of supposedly ruined households grew larger. The modern definitive version of the myth arrived in 1841, when journalist and poet Charles Mackay published extraordinary popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Lacking rigorous historical research, Mackay compiled existing folklore, polished it into a dramatic narrative, and presented it as factual history. His book became a massive commercial success, and his distorted account of Tulip Mania has been repeated unquestioningly ever since. Each time the story was retold, it got better. More dramatic. More moral. Less accurate. But if Tulip Mania was mostly a story we told ourselves, then what does that say about every bubble we think we understand? The real insight here isn't about tulips, and it isn't about 17th century Holland. It's about how we remember financial bubbles. Financial bubbles are not remembered for the scale of their economic damage. They endure in public memory based on how perfectly they fit traditional moral narratives of greed and righteous punishment. Tulip Mania endures because it is the perfect fable. It has beautiful, frivolous objects, flowers, which serve no practical purpose. It has absurd prices, a flower worth more than a house. It has satisfying comeuppance, the greedy get punished, and everyone learns a lesson about excess. It is a story that feels right. It confirms what we already believe about greed and madness and crowds. So we keep repeating it, even when the facts don't support it. But here is the problem. The bubbles that actually destroy economies, the ones that cause recessions, put people out of work, wipe out life savings, these are almost never the ones that make the best moral stories. The 2008 global financial crisis was not triggered by reckless amateur speculators trading absurd assets. It stemmed from respected institutional bankers trading mortgage-backed securities, assets widely deemed safe, prudent, and legitimate by mainstream finance. The repo market, whose freezing triggered the crisis, was so obscure and technically complex that few outside institutional finance had ever heard of it. Japan's late 1980s asset bubble was similarly not driven by grassroots market hysteria. It stemmed from central bank policies, international currency agreements, and large-scale institutional investment. A seemingly respectable, legitimate market surge ultimately led to 2 decades of national economic stagnation. The really dangerous bubbles are the ones dressed up as serious investments. The ones where smart, responsible people agree that prices are going up for good reasons. The ones that don't feel like bubbles at all. You can see this pattern repeating today. The crypto boom of 2021 was described endlessly in the press using the exact language of Tulip Mania. Speculation, mania, greed, madness. And it was a bubble. Prices did crash. A lot of people lost money. Yet it posed almost no systemic threat to the global financial system. It was a self-contained speculative market, fueled largely by retail investors and venture capital. When prices crashed, no major banks collapsed, no governments required to deploy bailouts, and the real economy remained largely unaffected. Meanwhile, the parts of the financial system that actually could cause systemic damage, the repo market, the leveraged loan market, the shadow banking system, these get almost no media attention. They're too boring. Too technical. They don't make good moral fables. There are no tulips, no memes, no charismatic characters to write headlines about. The next crisis won't come from the thing everyone is calling a mania. It will come from the thing everyone agrees is completely safe. Tulip Mania wasn't the greatest bubble in history. It was the greatest bubble story in history, and that's a very different thing. A small market event among a few hundred traders got amplified, over centuries, into the defining parable of financial madness, because it fit the moral narrative we wanted to tell. The next time you hear something compared to Tulip Mania, ask yourself a simple question: is this actually a systemic risk, or is it just a good story? Because the answer is almost always the second one. If you want to drift through the full story over 3 hours, the taverns of Amsterdam, the Ottoman botanists who first brought tulips west, the pamphleteers, and the birth of the futures market itself, in the slow, detailed version made for quiet nights, the link is in the description.